Hello and welcome to our show tonight. And this is CRST 151 and it's interview night. Yes. And we have here on my left a philosopher. And on my right we have a scientist. And in front of me we have you. Hello. And what's going to happen tonight in our wonderful show is that we're going to ask a simple question from both the philosopher and the scientist. We're going to ask, is there a God or not? When we ask the philosopher, he'll answer as a philosopher. When we ask the scientist, he'll answer as a scientist. When we ask you, you'll answer as someone who's thinking. Does that make sense? Sure it does. Well, let's start by asking the philosopher. Say, philosopher, is there a God or not?
Well, you can't answer a question like that without first asking the question, what do you mean by God? Of course, there are many answers to that question. So you must tell me your definition of God, and then I can answer that question. Because if you have a different definition of God, I'll have a different answer to your question.
Well, that's a good question. I really mean the Christian God, which would be a God who exists in his own dimension of being, a God who is not a part of our world, who cannot be seen and measured, because he doesn't belong to our dimension of existence. But he belongs to himself in his own measurement of existence, and a God who has all power to do anything he wants. That would be my definition of God. Does that help?
Well, that's a good philosophical description of God, and I can definitely work with that. Does a God exist like that in the universe? Well, first of all, I can tell you how I can't answer. I can't say, well, we've never seen anyone like that. You said that this God cannot be seen. I can't say, well, we've never measured any kind of God like that, because you said this God cannot be measured. You said, as far as you know, this kind of God does not exist in our dimension. Therefore, I can't use any arguments from this world to describe whether or not that God exists. Very interesting question.
So, are you saying that there's no way to measure God because God doesn't belong to our dimension of measurements? That would mean it's impossible to use any tools that we have in this world to be able to figure out if God exists or not. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. You understand perfectly. So it's difficult to say, oh, God does not exist because he can't be found. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. He could exist and not be found because he's in his own dimension, which means, therefore, that we have to ask the question again, does God exist? Well, I guess the only answer that I can give to that is, if God is good, and if God can do all things, and if there's evil in the world, and God does nothing to stop the evil, then either he is not good, or he is not able to do all things. It seems to me that that proof disproves the existence of God, at least the God you describe. There could be an evil God in the universe, and if there were an evil God in the universe, then it would be completely possible for God to exist. Frightening, but possible. But if God is good, and if God can do anything, and if there is bad in the world, and God does nothing to change it, then therefore that must mean that God cannot do anything, or that he is not good. So you can choose on that one.
Well, Mr. Philosopher, I have a question for you. how can you guess what good is? After all, isn't it possible that what you think and what I think good is, we might be wrong? After all, we're just human beings. Or perhaps something happened, and when that happened, it changed something that is good into something that's not good, and maybe God has a purpose, and that purpose is a good purpose, even though things now are not the way we wish they were. Or maybe 100,000 other questions that I can ask. How do you know what good is? Are you sure there's no God?
Well, you have me there, Sonny. You're right. There's no way for us to define what good is and be sure about it. I say good is one thing, and someone else might say good is another thing, but you're right. There may be a story we don't know, or there may be a plan we don't understand, or there may be a possibility that we don't see things very clearly. So, do I believe in God? No. Do I have a good reason for it? Well, if God does exist, I don't think I like him very much, because I don't really like the world he created very much. So I guess I'd say I don't think he exists, but if he does exist, I don't want him to. That's my best answer.
Well, that's very helpful. So what you're saying is you don't believe in God because you don't like the God who would exist if there were a God. It's not really about your understanding of philosophy, I guess. It's more the fact that you don't like the kind of God that God would be if he existed. That sounds like personal preference rather than philosophical logic. I guess it's time to ask our scientists the same question. Say, do you believe in God, or I should say, is there a God or not?
Well, that's a very good question, so we need to answer it from a scientific point of view. Let's do that. Answer number one is very clear, and it's finally, as far as I'm concerned, the only one we need. We have absolutely no scientific evidence anywhere in the universe that God exists. We have never detected his presence or detected any sign that he exists in any form anywhere. How can we say that God exists when there's no scientific evidence for it? That seems to me to be a final answer.
Well, I don't think that makes any sense because, after all, our definition of God is that God has his own dimension, and therefore we cannot measure him. He can't be seen, and he can't be measured, and he can't be observed. He could still exist in his own dimension without any of those things. That doesn't sound like a very logical way to talk, and it isn't scientific at all. You can't measure something with the wrong kind of measuring tool.
Well, that may be so. Let me give a better scientific explanation than that then. The second explanation would be the fact that we don't need God to explain the universe. People who were ignorant and uneducated always talked about God because they saw everything in the universe as magic. But we can explain everything by mathematics and physics and by chemistry and by careful observation and theory. We don't need an explanation of God to believe in anything. Science is enough for us.
Well, that's an interesting explanation, but it doesn't quite make logical sense. As a philosopher, I don't understand your logic. You say that because we don't need God, he doesn't exist. That's like a man saying to his wife, because I don't need you, you don't exist. That doesn't sound very logical to me.
Well, I kind of agree with him there. After all, that's pretty illogical, isn't it? It's almost illogical as saying that you don't believe that God exists because you don't like him. That doesn't sound like that's very logical either. You can not like someone, but they still can exist. I know my next door neighbor exists, but I don't like him. So I think we need to think a little more philosophically here and a lot more logically than we're doing. Let's keep working at this. Give me another reason that there's no God, because your first reasons are not very convincing.
Well, if you want to talk about logical, then answer this question. Who created God? That's what I'd like to know.
I hope you're just joking. That's not a scientific question. That's a philosophical question. And it's an easy question to answer. If God exists in his own dimension, then we don't even talk about creating him. He exists. He is who he is. He always is and always will be and always was. He just is. And his dimension doesn't even have time in it. That's a silly question. It doesn't make logical sense. If God is in his own dimension, then time does not refer to him. There is no beginning of God and there's no end. He created a time outside of himself. Every philosopher understands this. Don't you scientists ever read philosophy?
Well, that's very interesting to me because it shows me that God is who he is, and we don't want to try to make him into what we are to understand him. That's a good point. Do you have any scientific answers that explain why you say that God doesn't exist?
Well, yes, of course I do. I have a great scientific question for you. And if you can answer this question, I'll be very surprised. Okay. If God is completely good, and if God can do anything, then why is there suffering in the world? That's what I want to know. Why is there suffering in the world? That's my scientific question for you.
Well, didn't we already answer that question? Isn't that a philosophical question? But isn't it kind of not about logic? Didn't we figure out that there can be someone who is good and is able to do everything, but has a plan that is a good plan? Or maybe we don't know what good really is. Or maybe something happened. And whatever happened has changed the world so that it was good and will be good again, or something else that we really don't know. That doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, but even if it did, it isn't scientific even a little bit. It's completely 100% philosophy. Mr. Philosopher, did our scientists ask any question or answer any question using science? I didn't think so. Mr. Scientist, you are brilliant and you do wonderful work and we need you very much. But you're not a very good philosopher. You've come up with a lot of philosophical answers. None of your answers are scientific. I don't think you know why God doesn't exist. And that's kind of upsetting. You shouldn't be telling people God doesn't exist unless you stop being a scientist and start being a philosopher. Really, I think you're making a big mistake.
Well, little red monster, you've certainly shown me some things today. I still don't believe in God, but I don't believe in God because I just don't like him. And I guess that's my right, isn't it? If he's real, I still don't like him. I especially don't like him. And if he's not real, it doesn't really matter if I like him or not. But I think our scientific friend, I think he doesn't like God any better than I do. And so his belief in God, or the lack of belief in God, is because he doesn't like God, not because God is unscientific.
Well, this has been very informative. One thing we all should learn from this is that you shouldn't allow a scientist to tell you philosophical truths and expect that it's scientific. They may be right in what they say, but they're not saying it as scientists. They're saying it as philosophers. And honestly, Albert Einstein said that scientists are not very good philosophers. And that sure has been shown today, hasn't it? So I want you all to realize that if God exists or doesn't exist, you're not going to find that answer in science. You have to start with philosophy, or you can start with Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of many prophecies which are scientific in the sense that they happened in real time and space. And maybe, well, just maybe, you can also look at his resurrection and the wonderful evidence for that. But that's not tonight. Tonight, all we were talking about is, does God exist? And the answer from the philosopher is, I don't like God, and therefore I don't want him to exist. And the answer from our scientist is, I don't like God, and I don't want him to exist either. Interesting. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.